Hello everybody, and welcome to Chapter 8, and we're going to look at behavioral economics. So, behavioral economics is how human behavior interacts with economic theory. We're going to look at systematic errors in the origin of behavioral economics, our efficient error-prone brains, what's known as prospect theory, myopia and time inconsistency, and finally fairness and self-interest. So what's the origin of behavioral economics? In neoclassical economics, which is one of the older schools of economic thought, we believe our decisions are rational, but evidence shows that we make errors. So once again, we believe that consumers operate in that sense of rational self-interest, but it's pretty clear that people do make errors. And a lot of times people make what are called systematic errors, which are the same errors over and over again. So we needed another theory to explain this, and this is where behavioral economics come into play. In neoclassical economics, we make assumptions. People have stable preferences that aren't affected by context, meaning your preferences don't change, they're stable. People are eager and accurate calculating machines, meaning everybody is very good at calculating utility and what value is to them and all of that. People are good planners who possess plenty of willpower. And finally, people are almost entirely selfish and self-interested. And none of these assumptions are completely true. Parts of them can be true, and depending on the people, more so in some cases than others, but people aren't robots, and therefore their emotions, their behaviors come into play when determining their economic decisions. So behavioral economics focuses on the mental processes behind decisions. And we want to improve outcomes by improving decision making. So we don't have to replace neoclassical economics with behavioral economics, but we can complement them with each other. They can complement each other. So by applying both of them, we can improve our understanding of how people behave, especially in an economic sense. So neoclassical economists believe that consumers care a great deal about prices. But they can't really explain impulse buying. Think of any time you've impulse bought something, not cared about the price, maybe even bought something that necessarily wasn't worth what it cost just out of impulse. Whereas behavioral economics explains impulse buying and various other irrational behaviors. And it explains them with a wide variety of underlying factors in regard to human behavior. So what's rationality? Rationality meaning people are going to operate in a way that's always beneficial to them, logically, all of that. Neoclassical economics, how does it explain it? People are fundamentally rational, and they're going to adjust their choices and behaviors to best achieve their goals, and they won't make systematic errors. Behavioral economists believe the following. People are irrational and make many errors, reducing their chances of achieving their goals. And some can be regularly repeated, often also known as systematic errors. What about stability of preferences? In neoclassical economics, we say people's preferences are stable, not affected by context. They don't change. What you want or prefer is fixed for the most part. In behavioral economics, we say that people's preferences are unstable, and they're often inconsistent because they depend on context, framing effects. What is the broader context when you're buying something, or how are you feeling, or anything like that, is going to drift your preferences or change them. Capability for making mental calculations, well, this is subjective. Math ability varies from person to person, but neoclassical economics, we assume that people are eager and accurate calculators. Behavioral economics, we assume that the majority of people are actually pretty bad at math and try to avoid difficult computations if possible. That's something that's very true. Obviously, there are plenty of people who are very good at math as well, but we're just talking the majority of people, we would say, probably are not that well versed in math, and they try to use it sparingly and stick to easy calculations when they can. Some more stuff, ability to assess future options and possibilities. In neoclassical economics, we assume that people are just as good at predicting things in the future than their current options. Obviously, that's not necessarily the case. In behavioral economics, we would say people place insufficient weight on future events and outcomes. They think too much in the here and now and not towards the future. Strength of willpower. Neoclassical economics would say that people have no trouble resisting temptation. Obviously, that is not true. Everybody has temptations they give into at some point or another. And once again, obviously, in real life, people are very susceptible to temptations at times. Selfishness. In classical economics, we say that people are almost entirely self-interested and self-centered. In real life, obviously, that's not the case. People often can be selfless and generous or make decisions that benefit others at their own expense. As for fairness, in neoclassical economics, we say people do not care about fairness and only treat others well if doing so will get them something they want. Whereas in behavioral economics, we say many people care deeply about fairness and will often help others even when doing so will yield no personal benefits. So in neoclassical economics, we think people behave a lot more robotically than they actually do, whereas behavioral economics take into account a lot more of the spectrum of human emotion. So what are heuristics? Heuristics are ways that the brain evolved low energy mental shortcuts, and they're not the most accurate options, but they're used because the opportunity cost of perfection is high. Since heuristics are hardwired in our brains, it may be difficult for people to alter their behaviors, and people may be easy prey for those who understand their hardwired tendencies. We all have innate motivations and characteristics. So catching a baseball with the gaze heuristic, riding a bicycle with the steering heuristics, you learn how to do these things, then you basically can automate them. Think of once you learn a bike, the old adage, you can never forget. And that's pretty much true. You can jump on a bike years after learning or years after you last rode a bike and you still can ride it because you have those programmed mental shortcuts. So guesstimating ranks with recognition heuristics, the inflammation, and so we do stuff like this all the time to save time and energy. We use our innate shortcuts, but they can be wrong. And we all have things that make us tick. And if you can understand someone's hardwired tendencies, you may be able to take advantage of someone. Think of playing poker, for instance. If you can pick up on someone's tells or how they act when they get certain cards, you can give yourself a very large advantage. That's taking advantage of someone's heuristics or their innate characteristics. So brains are efficient, but they can be error prone. So brains use what are known as System 1 and System 2, their decision-making system. So System 1 is a lot of heuristics in the older parts of the brain, and System 2 uses newer parts to do your slow, deliberate, and conscious calculations. But think of every time we do complex math problems, for instance, cost-to-benefit ratios. They take time. They're fatiguing. They're not something that you can just quick snap make a decision. And if we try to calculate something to that degree for every decision we made, it would cause us to not really be able to get very much done. So your unconscious mental processes are the stuff that runs in the background that you don't even think of. They can suffer from a variety of biases, and these biases can lead to errors. So psychologists have identified a number of cognitive biases or thought biases, and here are a few relevant to economics and decision making. This will also serve you well in the business world if that is your intended career path. So confirmation bias refers to the tendency to only pay attention to information which agrees with one's preconceived notions. This is a very big problem, and everybody faces this to some degree. We're going to pay attention or give a lot more weight to information we come across that agrees with what we believe in than something that goes against it. And this is very common in politics, it's very common in business, and it's not a very good thing because it prevents us from learning things new or admitting that we may be wrong or that there may be information that's newer or better or more accurate. The overconfidence effect, that refers to people's tendency to be overly confident about how likely their judgments are to be correct. If you have to make a guess about something, you're probably going to, if I quiz you after you make the guess, how likely do you think you're correct? You're probably going to answer to a much higher percentage than the actual odds would state. Hindsight bias is when people retroactively believe that they were able to predict past events. Obviously, that's not necessarily true, but we convince ourselves that, oh, we saw this coming, or we saw this coming, or why didn't we buy the stock? We knew it was going to go up. Those are all examples of hindsight bias. Availability heuristic causes people to base their estimates about the likelihood of an event happening, not on facts, but on whether similar events come to mind. So that's using similar events we've maybe experienced or seen. So we lived through the pandemic. If it really scared you, you might say the odds of another pandemic in the next 10 years are more than 50%. Obviously, that's not true, but that would be an example of availability heuristic. Whereas there may be a high chance of an earthquake hitting an area, but if you've never experienced an earthquake, you might think the chance of that happening is a lot lower. Planning fallacy is the tendency people have to massively underestimate the time to complete a task. Think of any time a large public works project gets announced and then it goes over budget and over time. Those are all examples of planning fallacies. And framing effects occur when a change in context causes people to react differently to a particular piece of information based on the context it's in. Framing effects are used to devastating effectiveness in things like news articles and stuff like that. The information may be correct, but the way you present it may be biased or changed, and those are all examples of framing effects. Self-serving bias is not touched upon in the slides, but self-serving bias is that we bias our decisions in ways that benefit ourselves, but not necessarily to our own advantage. Self-serving bias is any time we attribute our successes to internal personal factors and not external factors. So we buy a stock and it triples in value and we say it's because of our own genius and we knew all of this. Meanwhile, the reason it tripled in value is the company invented some new drug that cures a disease that we had nothing to do with and we knew nothing about. If we take all of the credit for making all of this money, that would be an example of self-serving bias. So prospect theory, people judge good things and bad things in relative terms and as gains and losses to their status quo. People experience both the diminishing marginal utility for gains as well as diminishing marginal disutility for losses. And people experience loss aversion in that they feel losses much more intensely than gains. A lot of times, once again, back to my stock example, if you buy a stock and you make $100 in 6 months, yes, you made money, but you might be annoyed that you barely made anything, or you may even think of it negatively if you could have bought a different stock that did better, even though you made a gain. Whereas if that stock, instead of making $100, you lose almost all of your money, you lose 90% of your value, and you lose $10,000, you're going to probably feel that a lot more. So generally, people are much more loss averse. They feel losses a lot more than gains. Unless the gain is tremendous, moderate gains generally don't really elicit much of an effect, whereas losses, even not very large ones, make people a lot more emotionally reactive. So how people cope with negative possibilities is a central focus of behavioral economics. Many observations have been cataloged as to how people actually deal with the prospect of bad things as well as good things. And so marginal utility for gains and losses. So if you make a ton of money, the utility you get as you make more and more of it actually starts going down. That's marginal utility for gains. Obviously, if you start off with $1,000 and make $1 million from it, you'll get a tremendous amount of utility. But you get a lot less utility from that million to, let's say, 5 million. You'll still get utility, but not as nearly as much. And the same thing with losses. If losses start spiraling out of control, eventually it all becomes, in a way, almost academic. And the amount of disutility or negative utility you get from, let's say, your company is in the hole for $100,000, now it's in the hole for $1 million, it's going to be less of a shock. So diminishing marginal utility for gains and diminishing marginal disutility for losses is a very true point. So if we look here, prospect theory helps us understand how consumers plan and deal for life's up and downs. Businesses have to be very careful about increasing a price because once consumers become used to a price, they'll view any increase as a loss relative to the status quo they have been accustomed to. Anytime something that's been priced, think of Dollar Tree when they raised their price from $1 to $1.25 recently and consumers were up in arms. That's an example of this. Framing effects have major consequences for consumer behavior because any frame that alters whether they consider a situation to be a gain or a loss will affect their consumption decisions. So framing and advertising are very important. Anchoring and credit card bills. So by showing such small minimum payment amounts, credit card companies anchor many consumers into the expensive habit of paying off their debt slowly and running up interest rather than quickly. People think they don't have to pay very much money, not realizing if they do that, they're actually losing a lot of money towards interest. Things like mental accounting and overpriced warranties. So what's the endowment effect? The endowment effect is the tendency people have to put a higher valuation on anything that they currently possess than on identical items they do not possess but might purchase. So this happens when, let's say, you want to sell your used car. You think just because it's your car, it's worth more than the 50 other ones that are the same make and model and similar year on Craigslist. We see this all the time. That's an example of the endowment effect. We think our own thing is worth more than identical items that we could buy or broadly similar items. And the status quo bias is people tend to favor any opinion that's presented to them as being the default option. People don't usually like to rock the boat for the most part. Not everyone, but I'm just talking about the majority of consumers. So something being presented as the default option or the most common option is generally much more popular to the majority of consumers than something that would not be considered that status quo. And finally, mental accounting and overpriced warranties. A lot of times we value things incorrectly. Think of any time you buy a cheap product and they try to sell you a warranty on it. A lot of times those warranties just simply aren't worth it. They may have high deductibles. They may only cover things for a very short amount of time. And it may just simply not be worth doing. So if we look here, percentage of population consenting to be organ donors in various countries. So in these European countries, the ones where the default option is you are not an organ donor, very few people are. The ones where the default option is you are an organ donor and you have to opt out, most people are. So once again, people generally try to stick with the status quo or the default option, and we've proven this in many, many experiments in all sorts of things, and this is one very good way to explain consumer behavior. What about myopia and time inconsistency? So myopia we use in the sense that brains have a hard time conceptualizing the future. The primary consequence of this is when people are faced to choose between something that will generate benefits quickly and something that won't yield benefits for a long time, most people generally will strongly favor that quick, immediate option, even though it may not be in your benefit. So think of you win some sort of prize and you can get $10,000 now or $100,000 paid out over 10 years. There are probably a lot of people that might take the $10,000 now, not realizing that $100,000 paid out over 10 years would pay you $10,000 every year. Once again, some people will automatically choose something that's much more immediate. Maybe not necessarily if it paid you in year one, but let's say you make $100,000 in 10 years where you don't get your first payment until a year from now. That would be a better example. You don't get any money for a year. Even though you're going to get orders of magnitude more money, there would probably be a lot of people who didn't choose that. Time inconsistency is the tendency to systematically misjudge at the present time what you'll want to do with the future. We're very bad at predicting the future. It's as if your future self ends up disagreeing with your present self, and this is a major cause of self-control problems. The key to fighting time inconsistency and self-control problems is you need a good understanding of what your future self is likely to want. Your future self would probably not be very appreciative if you spend all of the money you have in the bank right now on a bunch of stuff you really don't need, even though it might make you happy in the moment. So you can make pre-commitments and take actions ahead of time to prevent your future self from doing much damage. So time inconsistency is a problem. People are very bad at judging time, judging the future, planning for the future, and not impulsively doing things. And also, Not impulsively doing things in the future either. Let's say you come into a lot of money. You're better off when you come into it locking some of it up in safe investments that you might not be able to touch for a while to prevent your future self from blowing it on nonsense. Examples here are early withdrawal penalties. You put money in a money market account or a CD. You actually get charged money if you try to take it out early. That's a way to discourage something like this. And there are similar things as well. Putting money away in things like IRAs or 401ks. These are all examples of this as well. Those are all examples of pre-commitments. What about fairness and self-interest? Well, people are not these selfish monsters that neoclassical economics thinks they are. Obviously, people do act in a selfish way about many things, but obviously fairness and things where you don't get any personal benefit happen all the time. Giving to charity, obeying the law, purchasing more expensive products if they're, let's say, fair trade products. They're not being made by sweatshops or slave labor or damaging the environment. Buying something that's more expensive that's environmentally friendly. Those are all examples of going against that pure self-interest and existing in a way that's more fair. So there's plenty of evidence for fairness. Many experiments have been run, and outcomes suggest people care more about fairness and are not purely self-interested. It's been found that people share with others even when being anonymous would allow them to be perfectly selfish, and people will reject deals that they consider unfair to themselves. Once again, we're talking about the majority of people. Obviously, there are some people who are pretty much purely selfish, and some people who are pretty much purely altruistic, and most people are some shade in between. Why does the threat of rejection increase cooperation? You could argue the threat of rejection can be construed as that which drives markets to increased allocative efficiency and productive efficiency. We don't want to be rejected by others, our business, or us personally, or anything else. So we're going to be more likely to cooperate for that reason. So cooperation and working together leads to market efficiency. Productive efficiency is making things as efficiently as possible. Allocative efficiency, making the right mix of goods and services demanded by consumers. And finally, ancient humans benefited more from short-term planning than long-term planning, and we've inherited this trait. Why? Ancient humans had to survive constantly in the here and now. They were constantly at risk, let's say, from predators and or then later on in the ancient world, war and things like that. And they were benefiting more from short-term planning than long-term planning because they needed to survive. And this is a problem. Most consumers, most people, focus much more on the here and now than in the future. If you have some form of a retirement account, you're doing better than a lot of consumers, because a lot of consumers don't actually do this. And then by the time they realize they need to save money for retirement, they're probably getting close to retiring, and then it becomes a problem. So things that we've done, things such as Social Security, that's one form of government-enforced long-term planning. Then there are things like IRAs and 401ks, which you can voluntarily contribute to, and those are very beneficial. If you do not have one, I would strongly recommend to anybody in this class, you should certainly open a Roth IRA in the near future and start putting money into it. It will serve you very well in the future. So that's going to take us to the end of this chapter. And once again, we're focusing on how human behavior can influence economic decisions.